The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife, as the teenage boy stood up in the 6th row, his fists clenched at his sides. Steve Harvey had been sharing stories about learning to be a better father when the young man's angry interruption stopped the entire studio cold. What happened next proved that sometimes the most important conversation is the one that starts with someone being brave enough to tell a successful man that his advice doesn't work for everyone. The Ellen DeGeneres Show studio hummed with inspirational energy this Wednesday afternoon in Burbank. 350 audience members filled the space, drawn by the opportunity to hear one of America's most beloved television personalities discuss his journey from homelessness to hosting multiple hit shows. Steve Harvey sat in the guest chair with his characteristic commanding presence, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit with a burgundy tie that somehow managed to look both professional and approachable. Ellen, radiant in a cream-colored blazer with intricate gold embossing that caught the studio lights, was thoroughly enjoying their conversation about resilience, faith, and the importance of never giving up on your dreams. "Steve, your story is so powerful because you've been completely transparent about your lowest moments," Ellen said, her voice carrying the deep respect she reserved for guests who had truly overcome adversity. "Living in your car, struggling to provide for your family, having to choose between gas money and food money. How did those experiences shape the father you became?" Steve leaned back in his chair, his hands resting confidently on the armrests as he considered the question with the wisdom that comes from surviving real hardship. "Ellen, I'll tell you something. Those tough times taught me that being a provider isn't just about money. It's about being emotionally present, about making sure your children know that no matter what's happening in your external circumstances, they are your priority." The audience listened with rapt attention, many nodding as they connected with stories of financial struggle and family pressure. Steve's authenticity was magnetic, his ability to transform personal pain into universal wisdom, making him one of the most trusted voices in entertainment. "You know, when I was sleeping in that 1976 Ford," Steve continued, "the hardest part wasn't being uncomfortable or hungry. The hardest part was calling my kids and hearing them ask when Daddy was coming home, and not being able to give them an answer. That's when I learned that children don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be honest about your struggles and determined about your comeback." But even as the conversation flowed with its usual inspirational rhythm, Ellen noticed growing tension in the 6th row. A teenage boy, probably 16 or 17, was becoming increasingly agitated as Steve spoke about father-child relationships and emotional availability. His body language suggested anger rather than inspiration, and Ellen could see him whispering intensely to the woman beside him, who appeared to be trying to calm him down. "Steve, what advice do you give to fathers who are struggling to connect with their children?" Ellen asked, though she found herself glancing repeatedly at the distressed teenager. "Especially fathers who maybe didn't have great role models themselves?" Steve's eyes lit up with passion, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had made him America's go-to relationship expert. "First thing I tell any man is this: your children are watching everything you do, not just listening to what you say. You want to teach them about perseverance? Show them by not giving up. You want to teach them about love? Show them by being present, by being vulnerable, by being the kind of father you wish you'd had." As Steve spoke about the importance of emotional availability and vulnerability, the teenager in the 6th row could no longer contain himself. He stood up abruptly, his movement so sudden and forceful that it caused a ripple of confusion throughout the studio. "That's easy to say when you have money," the young man shouted, his voice cracking with emotion and fury. "What about when your father works 3 jobs and still can't pay rent? What about when being emotionally available is a luxury you can't afford?" The unexpected outburst stunned the studio into complete silence. Steve's expression shifted immediately from motivational speaker to concerned human being, while Ellen stood up from her chair with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her body language indicating she was processing something serious and unexpected. "Young man," Steve said, his voice gentle but strong enough to carry across the studio. "What's your name?" "Marcus," the teenager replied, his fists still clenched at his sides, his anger barely contained. "Marcus Williams. And I came here thinking maybe you'd have some real advice for kids whose fathers don't have the luxury of choosing to be present." Ellen remained standing with her arms crossed, clearly recognizing that this moment required careful handling. This wasn't just teenage rebellion or attention-seeking behavior. This was genuine pain expressing itself as anger. "Marcus," Ellen said carefully, "can you tell us what's going on at home? What's making you feel like Steve's advice doesn't apply to your situation?" Marcus looked around the studio, clearly torn between the desire to be heard and the embarrassment of having made himself the center of attention. 17-year-old Marcus Williams from Compton was attending the taping with his aunt, using tickets she'd won at work, hoping against hope that maybe Steve Harvey would have some wisdom that could help their family situation. "My father works at a warehouse from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., then drives Uber until midnight, then does maintenance work at an office. Building from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., Marcus said, his voice shaking with exhaustion and frustration. "He's trying to keep us from getting evicted, and you're up here talking about being emotionally present and vulnerable. When is he supposed to do that? During his 4 hours of sleep?" The raw reality check hit the studio like cold water. Steve's expression transformed completely as he began to understand that his well-intentioned advice was landing very differently for someone whose family was in survival mode. Steve immediately stood up and began walking around his chair, his charcoal suit and burgundy tie creating a striking silhouette as he paced with obvious concern and growing understanding. "Marcus, first of all, your father sounds like a hero. Any man working 3 jobs to keep his family housed is doing exactly what he's supposed to do." Marcus stared at Steve, clearly surprised to hear validation rather than more advice about emotional availability. "But that's not what you said. You said children need fathers to be present and vulnerable. My dad is barely awake when he's home. He falls asleep at the dinner table when we're lucky enough to have dinner together." Ellen felt her heart breaking as she listened to this young man articulate the impossible position so many working-class families found themselves in, choosing between financial survival and emotional connection because the economic system didn't allow for both. "Marcus," Steve said, stopping his pacing to face the teenager directly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me clearly. What I was describing, that's advice for fathers who have choices. Your father doesn't have choices right now. He's in survival mode, and in survival mode, love looks different." The studio was completely silent as Steve continued, his voice carrying decades of lived experience with poverty and family struggle. "When your father falls asleep at the dinner table, that's not him being emotionally unavailable. That's him sacrificing his rest to spend even 5 minutes with his family. That's love, Marcus. That's presence in the only form it can take right now." Marcus's anger began to shift into something that looked like confusion and pain. "But I miss him. I need him. I have questions about life, about being a man, about everything. And he's never awake enough to talk to me. And everyone keeps telling me I should be grateful. But I just feel abandoned." Ellen uncrossed her arms and took a step toward Marcus, her expression softening as she recognized the core of his pain. "Marcus, you're allowed to miss your father even while you're proud of him. Those aren't contradictory feelings. They're both completely valid." Steve nodded emphatically, resuming his pacing as he worked through this complex situation. "Marcus, can I ask you something? Does your father ever talk to you while he's getting ready for work? Does he ever share anything about his day while he's transitioning between jobs?" Marcus considered this, his posture beginning to relax slightly. "Sometimes, he'll tell me about difficult customers, or he'll ask about my day while he's changing clothes, but it's always rushed, always distracted." "That's it right there," Steve said, pointing directly at Marcus with sudden intensity. That's your father being present in the only way his circumstances allow. He's sharing his struggles with you. He's asking about your life. He's including you in his reality even when he's exhausted beyond measure. Ellen walked closer to the audience area, her cream blazer and gold embossing catching the lights as she moved. Marcus, what Steve is saying is that presence doesn't always look like long, heart-to-heart conversations by the fireplace. Sometimes presence looks like a tired father asking about your day while he's putting on his work boots for the 3rd time in 18 hours. But what about the advice everyone gives about father-son bonding? Marcus asked, his voice smaller now, more vulnerable. What about teaching me to be a man, showing me how relationships work, helping me navigate life? Steve stopped pacing entirely and looked directly at Marcus with fierce intensity. Son, your father is teaching you how to be a man every single day. He's showing you what sacrifice looks like, what responsibility means, what it looks like to never give up even when you're exhausted beyond belief. That's the most important lesson about manhood you'll ever receive. Marcus stared at Steve, clearly struggling to reconcile this perspective with months or maybe years of feeling emotionally neglected. But I have questions. I need guidance. I need someone to talk to about things I'm going through. And that's exactly why you stood up today, Ellen said with sudden understanding. You recognized that you needed mentorship and guidance, so you spoke up in a room full of 400 people and demanded to be heard. That's not weakness, Marcus. That's leadership. Steve's expression shifted to something approaching awe as he looked at Marcus with new appreciation. Ellen's absolutely right. Marcus, what you just did, standing up to a successful adult and challenging his advice because it didn't serve your reality, that takes courage most grown men don't have. Marcus looked around the studio, taking in the faces of audience members who were clearly moved by his story, many nodding with recognition rather than judgment. You know what else your father is teaching you? Steve continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. He's teaching you that sometimes love means working yourself to exhaustion for people who might not even notice the sacrifice. He's teaching you that being a provider sometimes means being invisible. And most importantly, he's teaching you that temporary sacrifice can lead to long-term stability. Ellen felt the power of this conversation building, understanding that they were witnessing something that could reframe how society thinks about working-class fatherhood and emotional availability. Marcus, Ellen said, I want to ask you something. When you think about the kind of father you might want to be someday, do you think you'd want to combine your father's work ethic with maybe a different approach to communication? Marcus considered this thoughtfully, his expression shifting from anger to something that looked like possibility. Yeah, I think I'd want to work hard like him, but maybe find ways to connect that don't require so much time and energy. Steve clapped his hands together with sudden enthusiasm. Now that's what I'm talking about. Marcus, you just articulated something incredibly mature. You're not rejecting your father's model, you're wanting to build on it. That's evolution, not criticism. Ellen nodded, pointing toward Marcus with obvious admiration. And Marcus, you've already started that process. You came here seeking mentorship and guidance, which means you're actively looking for the additional support your father can't provide right now due to circumstances beyond his control. But what do I do with all these feelings about missing him? Marcus asked, his voice carrying months of suppressed longing. How do I appreciate his sacrifice while still needing more from him than he can give? Steve walked to the very edge of the stage, positioning himself as close to Marcus as possible. Son, you honor both of those feelings by understanding that they're not contradictory. You can be grateful for his sacrifice and sad about what it costs your relationship. Both things are true, and both things are okay. Ellen felt tears springing to her eyes as she watched this young man receive the emotional validation he had been desperately seeking. Marcus, What would it look like if you started seeing those rushed conversations while your father gets ready for work as precious moments, rather than inadequate substitutes? Marcus's expression changed completely as he considered this reframing. I guess I'd pay more attention. I'd ask better questions in the time we do have. I'd maybe text him during his breaks to let him know I'm thinking about him. Exactly, Steve said, his voice full of excitement and approval. Marcus, you just figured out how to have a relationship within the constraints of your reality rather than waiting for your reality to change. Ellen turned to address the camera, her cream-colored blazer and gold details creating a striking image as she spoke to millions of viewers. This conversation is so important because it reminds us that good parenting doesn't have a one-size-fits-all formula. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is work 3 jobs. Sometimes presence looks like sacrifice rather than availability. Steve nodded emphatically, his hands now clasped behind his back in a gesture of deep respect for Marcus. And Marcus, I want you to know something. Your father may not be able to give you long conversations right now, but he's given you something even more valuable. He's given you an example of what it looks like to never give up on the people you love. Marcus wiped his eyes, looking around the studio with an expression that had completely transformed from anger to something that looked like peace and understanding. There's one more thing, Steve said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Marcus, I want you to have my personal phone number. Not because your father isn't enough, but because every young man deserves access to mentorship and guidance from multiple sources. Your father is teaching you about sacrifice and responsibility. Maybe I can help fill in some gaps about other aspects of growing up. Marcus stared at the business card Steve was offering, clearly overwhelmed by this unexpected offer of ongoing support. And Marcus, Ellen added, I want you to bring your father to the show. I want to meet the man who's working 3 jobs to keep his family together, and I want to make sure he knows what an incredible young man he's raising. The studio erupted in applause, not the polite television kind, but the sustained, emotional recognition of witnessing something authentic and transformative. Many audience members were on their feet, clearly moved by this honest conversation about working-class struggle and different forms of love. 6 months later, Marcus Williams had started a support group for teenagers whose parents worked multiple jobs, creating a space where young people could process feelings of abandonment while learning to recognize sacrifice as love. His father, Robert, had been a guest on Ellen's show, where his quiet dignity and obvious love for his son had moved millions of viewers. Steve Harvey had partnered with several organizations to create mentorship programs specifically for children of working parents, understanding that traditional father-son activities weren't accessible to families in survival mode. Ellen's show began featuring regular segments about different forms of parental love, highlighting families who showed care through sacrifice rather than traditional bonding activities. Marcus's relationship with his father had transformed completely once he learned to see their brief interactions as precious rather than inadequate. He began treasuring the moments when his father shared work stories, understanding that being included in his father's reality was itself a form of intimacy and trust. Because sometimes the most important lesson about love is learning to recognize it in all its forms, not just the convenient ones, not just the comfortable ones, but especially the ones that require sacrifice, endurance, and the quiet heroism of showing up every day even when you're exhausted, even when no one notices, even when appreciation feels impossible to find the time or energy to express.